Okay, let's go ahead and get started with today's session. This is Jason Warman from Pack Genesis. Thanks for joining today. This is session 7 in our series of training topics on IBM Aspera. Today we're going to be covering Aspera Orchestrator. I'm joined today by Randy Hall. He's our lead consultant at here at Pack Genesis and has done many Orchestrator deployments for customers over the years. A lot of expertise specifically in Orchestrator, so he's going to be handling the bulk of the information today. In particular, just to give a quick overview of today's agenda, I'm going to start with kind of a basic overview of Aspera Orchestrator. I don't like to do too many slides for these training sessions, but because Orchestrator is sort of so different and a lot of folks aren't very familiar with it from an end user perspective, we will spend a few minutes going over it. We'll also do some terminology with Randy, automation levels, triggers. So these are some of the specifics inside of the Orchestrator application. He'll also walk through an installation of Orchestrator, go through the user interface and some of those components, and then actually build an example workflow, which is often the best way to really kind of get your head wrapped around what some of the what all of these things really mean and what the capabilities are inside of Orchestrator. As always, we're going to reserve some time at the end of today's session for Q&A. So if you have any questions as we walk through this today, please jot them down, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end of today's session. So just as again, sort of a brief reminder or quick overview around the Orchestrator application, this is a web application that's available from IBM Aspera that's specifically geared towards creating and executing file-based workflows. It has a sort of a Visio-like user interface where you can drag and drop different elements, including plugins or logic operators or decision trees and branches in a workflow designer to create what makes sense as far as your file-based workflow. Typically, and really probably the initial reason why Orchestrator was developed is to help, decide what happens or automate what happens after an Aspera file transfer comes into play, or maybe what are the steps that need to happen to prepare for and then execute an Aspera file transfer. However, it really isn't, it is sort of a general file-based workflow tool. It doesn't necessarily need to involve an Aspera transfer at any step of the way, although it often does. You'll see some of the key features here, including monitoring of workflows and work orders as they run through. There is role-based access control that can integrate with network directories as well as SAML. That role-based access control is important when you think about sort of the end-to-end life cycle of a workflow, where you may have administrators that are creating, designing, editing these workflows, but you may also have operators that don't need that level of access, but may need to come in to simply monitor a dashboard to see what's happening right now with files as they make their way through the system. Or even have human interaction steps, for example, a quick, human visual QC approval or reject as part of a workflow as well. This Orchestrator, of course, integrates with all the Aspera software and Aspera utilities, but there's also a very large library of plugins that are available through Orchestrator that Randy's going to go into some detail about, and that you'll see firsthand to make this useful with all of the other parts and pieces of your workflow as they kind of go through the system. So this is anything from third-party commercial applications that have APIs available to more system OS level or even integration with open source utilities that may be useful for helping your files make their way through the system. Just a brief sort of example use case for Orchestrator. This is sort of touching on, several of the different pieces here. You can think of Orchestrator being involved in, monitoring and then also making those API calls to initiate the different steps as part of this workflow. So in this case, we're talking about content starting here on the left that's ingested on premise where an Aspera HSTS and Aspera node lives, right? So this could be something that's coming in as an Aspera transfer. For example, if you have outside parties that are submitting content to your Aspera server. But these could also be, locally generated files, right? So this is maybe something that's coming directly off of a, another process, either, from a CAM or something else that's generating files on the ingest side here. Step two, you can think of as of being, first of all, this transfer, this push from on-prem into a cloud environment where we're doing some cloud-based transcoding. As I mentioned, there are a large number of plugins for Aspera Orchestrator for transcoders, both online SaaS-based transcoding services, as well as transcoders that you would deploy on-prem. Really, it's sort of Orchestrator's agnostic to all of that, right? You can see here it's really just monitoring for files in this first step, making a little Aspera transfer, and or kicking off this transcode on the second step. And then moving on to this this third box here, the distribution to end users. In this case, we have Orchestrator taking out those transcoded assets, creating Aspera fastspec packages out of them, addressed to the the end consumers here that will get that fastspec link saying, hey, here's here's your new content. Click on the link to download it. And then finally, in this example, you can think of an archive step, right? I've got my initial asset on-prem here. We did some work in the cloud, but we also want to archive this, in this case, to 2 different locations, right? One can be a blob storage in the Azure cloud, and then maybe S3 or Glacier in AWS. So, kind of a wide-ranging end-to-end workflow here, but just again, sort of a little bit of a basic to get you thinking about how Orchestrator can feed into each of these steps of the process. For some of our customers, it may make sense for Orchestrator to do this completely end to end. In other cases, maybe there's a step or two that are already automated that that Orchestrator can sort of ignore and then work out. Take the output from one of those early steps, for example, and then just make its way through the rest of the workflow. Finally, this is just a very basic sort of subset of the plugins that are available, but just to give you an idea of what some of the Orchestrator plugins are, there's actually, I think 150, 200 different plugins, something like that, available in the system, but it really is wide ranging to be able to integrate with a number of different applications, third-party applications, open source pieces, and then even down to, very specific or OS level type of operations that you would typically do, maybe through a script. You can build those into part of an Orchestrator workflow as well, to make sure that we're kind of covering the bases end to end on what happens to your files as they make their way through your systems. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it over to Randy Hall. Again, Randy is a lead consultant here at Pack Genesis with a ton of experience in Aspera Orchestrator. So Randy, take it away.
Okay, let me get my desktop up here. Sorry, yeah, I had this had this staged here, and Where's my button for starting PowerPoint? Okay. So you already saw a screenshot of what a workflow looks like. As was said already, you can do all sorts of things with it. You've got custom plugins to interact with specific applications. You have generic plugins that can interact with REST-based APIs. You could run operating system command line utilities. But all of the workflows are built in a visual manner like this. And it's got an advantage of being able to visualize what's going on. And after a workflow is put together and in use, and you've got changeover over the years in the department, somebody else can come in and visually look at it and get an idea of what that workflow is doing a lot easier than going through tons of code and scripts and cron jobs and other miscellaneous things that have been used in the past. So in order, Orchestrator, it's got a lot of components in it. So terminology is really important. And we use the word workflow as the designer level view. It's what it's the description of what is going to happen. A work order is an instantiation of that workflow. So in programming terms, think of a workflow as a class and a work order as an object. So you'll only have one workflow which defines what's being done, but that may be initiated or into hundreds or thousands of work orders based on that workflow in a given day or whatever the requirements happen to be. Inside workflows, you have steps, and the step is, or steps were these objects that you drop on to the whiteboard. And each step does a specific thing. And we've got about 200 different steps that we can put in any order and execute. And the in order for these jobs to work, you have in the background an engine that dispatches the steps to various backend processes that we call workers. And Orchestrator is the one application that's in this product suite that doesn't have any recommend minimum requirements, because the requirements are based 100% on how you're going to deploy it and what you're going to be doing with it. So a default installation has a half a dozen workers that can work on things simultaneously. You may have to scale that up to 50 workers if you're doing a certain subset of information. But those workers are they do the work. Simply put. So workflows are, as was mentioned, they're file-based workflows. It's actually not true. They can be file-based, but they can also be based on any other type of trigger. So they're more like action-based. So a workflow can be kicked off by a watcher that is looking for files. It could be kicked off by some query that you're making against a SQL or Oracle database that kicks off when a certain event is true. It could be something that you kick off manually by an operator filling in variables and hitting the submit button. It could be driven by an API. For example, a media management system may send an API call to a workflow on Orchestrator, and then Orchestrator takes care of assembling all the objects that were passed to it and building it into a fastbacks package and delivering it to multiple locations. And those we call those things triggers for the for starting the workflows up. Triggers can operate on local file systems or remote file systems. They can also interface directly with the Aspera products using the Node API. So although it is polling the server every 10 seconds for what's on the server or what's on the transfer server, it's very efficient because the transfer server keeps track of the calls, and Orchestrator essentially is saying, give me everything that's happened since the last time I talked to you. So whether it's 10 seconds or 10 minutes, it's just the minimum amount of information. You can trigger off of email boxes. That's one trigger that I've not personally implemented for anybody, but it's there. The database watcher that I mentioned. Scheduler, this is your cron job. You can say, I want this cleanup job to run every day at 2 a.m. And it can handle picking that job off, at the specified time. The watchers also keep histories of whatever they've seen based on persistence value. You could have a workflow that will look for new files and then do something with them, but the files stay in the ingest directory. If you were to stop that workflow and start it up again, you don't want it to reprocess the thousands of files that are already in that workflow. So it gives you the option of keeping track of what it's seen before, so that when you start that back up, everything that it's taken action on is excluded from the triggers. So you only take action on new things that are coming in. So Orchestrator is, it's fairly easy to install. All you need is a Linux box, and I ran a demo. I ran an install and recorded the install so that I wouldn't have to be typing and doing the install at the same time. But we're starting off with a CentOS 7 box here. You could also run it on CentOS 8. There is a library called libaio that it's installed by default on CentOS 7, which you can see here. I'm getting that it's already installed, but it's not installed by default on a minimal install for CentOS 8. Hopefully it'll be addressed in the future, but right now the installer just doesn't work unless that library is installed if you happen to be running on a CentOS 8 box. Once you have that prerequisite installed, Orchestrator is composed of 2 RPMs, the Orchestrator code itself, as well as a common package, which includes our distributed versions of Apache and MySQL and Ruby. And as long, you just have to make sure that when you do the install, you grab both of them at the same time. They're paired together. You don't want to mix the wrong common with the wrong Orchestrator. Things might not show up as breaking, but they're only tested with certain sets. Once the installer finishes, you run the ASCTL command, which I believe you've seen in previous demos of the products here. ASCTL is the Aspera control script that allows you to set up and manage the various Aspera applications. So on this box, we're going to do Orchestrator setup, and it gives you a couple of different options. Streamlined and detailed. A detailed install will allow you to specify things such as that you're running MySQL on a different box. I'm just going to do a streamlined install here. So it will install a local copy of MySQL. Everything is running internally on this one box with no external dependencies. You specify the password that you want to use, apply to the database, and the host name that you want used for the embedded SSL certificate that it's going to generate. And you let it run. And you make sure that the firewall is open so that you can connect to the Orchestrator instance. Recent browsers, due to security concerns, have become kind of difficult to connect to self-signed certificates. In fact, some of them flat out refuse to allow you to connect to a development box, or even something on your own network that's not properly signed. So there is a command that is useful to get you past that. Typing ASCTL Apache gives you a list of all of the options that this script will let you manage the Apache web server with. One of them is to install your own self-signed certificate, or your own, not self-signed, but your own legitimate certificate that's signed by a trusted certificate authority. I've already pre-staged those files on my demo machine here. So I go ahead and type in the command to load it, say that I want to, and then it loads it, and I have to tell it that it's going to restart both Apache and Orchestrator, and starts the processes up. This is the first view you get of what those worker processes are. The default install has 2 asynchronous and 4 synchronous work orders or workers. The difference between the two is the type of actions that they will execute. If you look at a file watcher, it does a very quick thing. It goes and looks and sees what's in the file system. And then if there's nothing new, it exits. The engine will later dispatch that worker or that step to run again, and it will run on another asynchronous worker. The asynchronous workers there are so that your system doesn't completely lock up and feel unresponsive, because there are some steps such as an FTP or secure FTP or a local transcode with FFmpeg that are called synchronous, because they will consume and they'll hold that worker the entire time the job is running. And if you have 6 jobs that are, they take 10 minutes to run, and we allow it to consume all 6 of these workers, your system's not going to do anything until it finishes. So a couple of them are dedicated for just the short bursty type stuff that is going to only take less than a second, like watchers or rest calls. And then the synchronous workers take care of the large, long-running applications. The other thing that you need in order to get the install running is the license file. And you could either go to the website and paste it in, or you can copy it directly into the configuration directory. On Orchestrator, this Aspera var config Orchestrator is the folder that stores all of your site-related custom configurations, custom steps, everything that it makes your installation your own. And after I've run the status command again, I can see that all the jobs are running. I've got a process ID next to all of them. So that's the install. The next thing to do is to go to the web interface to finish it up. So the very first time you go into Orchestrator, the username is admin and there's no password. It's going to prompt you to set a new password. And I guess I did not copy my license file in here correctly. No problem. Let me go to my downloads. Actually, I have that in. All right, so I just pasted the license in here, and gives me an error message because I did it twice. But now, instead of going to the license page, which is where the only place you can go if you don't have a license, we are presented with the Orchestrator interface. I don't have any workflows installed because it's a brand new install. But over here on the left-hand side under workflows, you can see the actions that are available. Very few actions are available initially because loading extra actions that you don't need consume more RAM and make startup time longer. So before I can work with any engine or with any of these 200 actions, I have to go to the engine tab and select plugins. And here's where I'm presented the list of about 200 various plugins that are available in Orchestrator. So if there's one that I want, if I'm parsing ADI3 files, I can come here and I can click enable, and that plugin will now be loaded and available in the back end for processing, and it'll be available in the workflow designer so that I can drag items from the left-hand side. Work orders are obviously not going to have anything here until we've actually run some workflows. So the best way to get an idea of how Orchestrator works and some of the nuances of building a workflow is to build a workflow. So my example here, I want to ingest files and I want to verify that they're in the correct format. If they're in the correct format, I want to, and their MD5s are correct, I want to use media info to get some, pull the specific details from the video file. So my ingest requirements is that each media file is going to have a JSON file that contains two fields. One of them is the name of the media file, and the other is the MD5 that media file is expected to have. A couple of other requirements is I don't want to do anything with media files that arrive that don't have a JSON file associated with them. So if you just drop a video file in there, it's just going to sit there. And I don't want it to sit forever if a JSON file arrives that specifies a media file that never shows up. I want to have some sort of timeout on it so that it it'll get canceled and not sit there and have that workflow run forever. So the best way to build workflows is to break them up into smaller pieces. Don't try to build the entire thing all at once. So the first workflow I'm going to build, I'm just going to look for files and I'm going to calculate their MD5s. And what this is going to, what we're going to get from this is, we'll see, how plugins are imported, how they're added to the to the whiteboard. We're going to look at parameters of, how you get specific, pass like folder names into your workflows. We'll look at inputs and outputs so that we can see how the individual steps interact with one another. and we're going to look at what a watcher does. So let me switch back over to my running instance. And I'm going to build a new workflow. I'm going to give it a name. You can leave the workflow ID here. It's used to internally identify the workflows so that when you have one workflow that might call another workflow, it calls it by the workflow ID. There's certain cases where you want to change that, but most of the time just leave it by default. When you're creating the workflow, you can also choose how long or how many days you want to purge the information out of the system, whether you want to limit it to a single instance of this, a single work order that's running. So if you start up a second one, it just sits there and waits until the first one finishes. Or apply tags, which are string values that you can use for searching, which are very handy when you're processing thousands of files per day. Try again, new. I don't know what that was about. Probably because I'm running it on a virtual machine, and I didn't give it but one CPU and a little bit of memory. So this is what's called the whiteboard. Actually, I don't know that it's called the whiteboard or labeled as a whiteboard anywhere in the user interface, but internally, Orchestrator calls this a whiteboard. So what I want to do is specify, first I want to specify where I'm going to be looking for files. So parameters are a very convenient way to supply information to a workflow. So I'm going to call it, call this ingest. And for parameters, you can specify, well, for all parameters, you have to specify what type of value it is, whether it's a string or a number or time. Then you can specify whether it's provided at runtime, in which Orchestrator will prompt for it. If you try to launch it manually, you can specify whether it's optional. This, I want it to be a constant. So this is going to be root test. Let's see where I put these files. Test_video. I'm going to connect it to the beginning, which means this is a global variable that is accessible from any step along the way. Now, I don't want to have to specify the files that I'm going to be scanning. The Orchestrator is all about automation. I want Orchestrator to do something when it sees a file. So let's take the look at a trigger here, and I'm going to take a local file watcher. File. I'll double click on that, and I will select the template configuration. I'll just hit new here because I don't want to, I don't have any pre-built configurations, but you can build a configuration of any of these steps and pre-fill it with all the parameters that you want and save it, and then use that as a template in multiple places in your workflows so that you don't have to worry about having the same code in multiple places and have to worry about changing it in all those places. If you decide to make a change, you can change it in the one common place, and everything that refers to it sees that new configuration. Now, I could fill in where I want to look. I could fill in the value here in my watch folder of the directory that I'm looking for, but I want that to come from this input value. So I'm going to select this tab called Inputs. Why it happened? All right, I'm going to save it every step along the way. New inputs. The directory maps to the value that I lost. So I'll put my parameter back here. Ingest. It's a string root test video. So before I had nothing here. Now it's going to show me all the values that are available to me. So I can now select ingest. I want this trigger to be ongoing, and this option is available in many of the triggers. This means that once it finds something, it's going to continue along the workflow, but it's also going to spawn off another copy of itself to wait for the next item. So it doesn't have to work through the entire workflow when it finds something. It can start on that immediately, and then it goes back and immediately looks for the next item. I am going to look for star.mpg and save this. And I want to I want to do something here. The flow from one step to another is controlled by these arrows. The green dot is the path that the flow will take if this watch step succeeds. The yellow would be for a failure, and the red is an error. So you can also think of these, the green as true, the yellow as false, and the red is divided by 0. So again, I double click and I select a template to use. And come to my inputs and select the file path. We have ingest because it's global. We have step information, which is some specific information that every step generates that's always available from the prior step. And we have file name, which is a value that comes from the watch folder. And we can see it over here if we go to outputs. We see that we have file name as a string. So when it finds something, it's going to output the file name of what it found. And then I take that and input it into the file path that I'm going to use to calculate. So if everything is good, when I save it, it doesn't have any red backgrounds behind it. That means that, not that it's going to work, but it means that the stuff like required parameters are filled in, and it looks syntactically correct. So, to summarize what I did here, we've got the file name from the action from the local file watcher, and that becomes the input path for the MD5 calculation. So I save and then I publish. So now I have my demo workflow here and I can launch it. When I launch it in the user interface, this is where it would ask me for any optional or required parameters that haven't already been filled in. So I've now launched the work order and I can see it over here in the user interface. And when I click on it, I can see that it was triggered by a file that matched this. It matched the star.mpeg, so it gives me the file name. And when I look at the next step, the calculate, I can see that file path coming in here and the value, the MD5 value that it created. And it also spits out the file path of the file that it checked. And again, step information for this step, which most of the time you can ignore the step information. It's just always there. Now, when I refresh the screen, I'll see that there's actually one that's in progress and two that have completed. The one that's in progress is this watch step, which is continuing to look for new candidate files. When it finds something, then it spins off these other copies. So I have one that was triggered by the 640 by 360, and I have another one that was kicked off by the 1280 by 720. So now we've got a little bit of functionality. Let's go make or start fleshing out our workflow. So rather than, let me go back here just to go over the key points. The plugins, they show up on the left-hand side of the workflow. You drag them over into your whiteboard when you want to use them. Parameters such as ingest are things that you can use them as constants. You can also use them as optional or required fields that one workflow can use to call another. And the inputs and outputs, are one. You map inputs from in your step by taking the outputs from previous steps, and the watcher, which will do something. It'll trigger when it sees something, but it keeps on working and looking for more additional things to work on. So now let's add the logic to look at that JSON file and introduce another parameter or another action that's designed to take a JSON structure, parse it, and then turn it into output variables. So let's come back to my demo. Give me some more room here. And I want another file watcher because I need to look for the JSON file. And the collection manager is what's used for parsing and manipulating JSON objects. So we're going to look for a JSON file, then we're going to parse it. Here's the example of when I saved that these are invalid because there's required fields that actually the templates aren't even defined. So new configuration. And this is going to be just almost exactly like before. We're going to take the directory from ingest, and the trigger is going to be a JSON in this particular case. One other thing we want to do is we want to provide the contents of that file as an additional output. So by checking this, I'm not only going to get file name, I'm also going to get the file content, which is our JSON file, as an output variable. On my input, I can now take the source JSON collection, which is provided by file content. And in my JSON file, I have two values. One is name, which is a string, and the other is MD5, which is another string. So when this file gets processed, I'm going to have, it did it again. So here's the difference between saved and published. This one here was the published one that is my production one. It's still running. The latest is the one that I've been working on. So you get a little bit of isolation between your production and and when you're making tweaks or changes to your workflows. So on the outputs, now I have my user-defined name and MD5 that are coming out of this workflow. So this first one will find the JSON, provide the JSON to this one. This one is going to pull those variables out. And now I'm not going to look for start.mpg. I want to look for that specific file that was specified in my JSON file. And where I'm going to look for it is ingest, which is global. And instead of just calculating the file, still using the same file name that came out of that's now second step for finding the MPEG file, I'm going to check it against the value of the MD5. Where did that file go? Where that variable go? Well, it didn't go anywhere. It was never delivered to this step. Global variables are available everywhere. But if I want the MD5 value from this step to be available here, I have to go into every intervening step, go to the outputs, and tell it that that is a value that I want to pass through to the next step. Once I pass it through, now it becomes a value that I can select. So I am going to go ahead and cancel this step because I don't want my old copy running anymore. And I want to run this new version. So it found 3 candidate files. They're going to remain candidate files until it determines that the files aren't changing. It watches the size, the timestamp, and I think a couple of other things on the file system. Make sure that nothing changes, in between the 30 seconds that it looks, so that it doesn't grab a file that's still in the process of being downloaded. I have an error in my workflow, and it's telling me that invalid input. The file name was expected but not found, and yeah, right there I don't have it. That must have been one of the values that I lost when my workflow didn't get saved properly. Inputs and string. Oh, it's even more basic than that. Oh, it is name. Okay. Name. What is my? So if I go back to the work orders, I can see the outputs of each step. So when I'm troubleshooting this, I can see that my I'm not passing anything into the step. File content. Okay, I think I selected the wrong value for my my input. Inputs, and oh, I'm not selecting anything. That explains it. So my source JSON collection is file content. Save, publish. And I'm going to come here and I'm going to destroy all of these because I want to reprocess any of the steps that it's already seen before. So 3 candidate files again. Now you can see we've got this step. It parsed this file and it pulled out the name value and the MD5 value, which I intentionally put as a bogus value in there because I needed to create a case that would fail. And we can see that this calculate failed because it did not match the provided checksum. However, if I look at one in process, one failed. I look at this one here, and it's this is the one that specified a file that doesn't exist. This one is sitting here, and this is going to never quit. It's going to be looking for this file forever, which is not optimal. So so the key points is, we had to pass that variable through, the MD5 through this watch for file before it was exposed to this value here. And that this MD5 now generates a pass or fail result. So if it fails, it would go through the green path. And if it passes, it goes to the green path. If it fails, it can go this path, which can do something like send an email that this asset's not correct, or make a REST call to your MAM or delete the file, or whatever you need to do that can automate this process so that you don't have to have a human deal with this error condition. Like I said, it's all about automation. This next version is how you can deal with timeouts. And this introduces parallel execution of steps. Let me go back to here. And rather than go through the tedium of building the, I've got a bunch of my work, my steps, or my workers turned off just for performance on my virtual machine. I think having another mongrel up and running, which is the this is the backend process that handles the web requests for the UI, or if you're using Orchestrator as an API. I think turning that on will keep me from losing my workflows. So let me go back to my I'll go ahead and just open this one up. So This is a parallel task. You can see that you've got two lines that are coming out of the parse JSON. You can see when you move things around. You've also got Bezier or fan. We start getting a lot of lines, and if they start crossing over one another, making some of them curved or some of them straight helps visually. Sometimes you just can't make it so that you have no overlapping lines. But I digress on that, on the lines issue. This is a parallel execution. It's going to launch both the watch for file and this this action, which is a trigger. And this trigger, I have set it up so that exactly 1 minute after this step starts, it will complete. When it completes, it is essentially going to go down here to the failed output. And when you're doing parallel operations in Orchestrator, it's whoever gets the finish line first wins. So when this timer, gets to 1 minute and makes its way to the failed, it's going to automatically cancel your step that's looking for a file that doesn't exist. And as such, it's never going to run the MD5 because the previous step never existed. When you're dealing with parallel execution, you want to make sure that what you're doing is actually possible to complete. I have to add a logic operator here, which is an OR, because whenever you combine things together, it's treated as an AND. And unless you're talking about quantum mechanics, something can't be true and false at the same time. So in this case, excuse me. In this case, for this step, if it passes, I want it to go to failed. If it fails, I want it to go to failed. And if my MD5 fails, I want it to go to failed. Well, that's 3 different paths that get here, and there's no way that this point can be reached by all 3 of them at the same time. So what this would result in is a workflow that just appears to hang. It doesn't exit. It's hard to tell why. So you need to make sure that this is a logical OR. And then when you change this to an OR, it fixes the easier just to get rid of them. And then once you have a logical OR, now it's possible that any one of these paths, if any one of these paths are satisfied, it'll then go to failed. The logical AND can be useful if you have something that you truly want to run in parallel, but you want them, those parallel jobs to all be complete before you do the next step. In that case, you don't have to put a logical operator here because everything is an implicit AND. So let me, so from the previous workflow, this is all I added was the parallel step and the logical operator. So now when I run this workflow, so I'll see here that it's looking for the one candidate file. This was a case where it found it, and the 1 minute timeout got canceled because it reached the end of the workflow. This was the case where the MD5 in the file was wrong, so it ended up hitting the. Oh, I think I ran the one from the next section. So one failed. This is the one still looking for files. And this is the one that's still looking for the file that was specified in the JSON. And after 1 minute, this step will complete and it's going to cancel the watch for file because, you know, it was the first to finish line. And that takes care of our case of, you know, the error case where we have a metadata file, but there's no associated no associated media to go along with it. So again, the points, you know, are the parallel execution is possible, and make sure that your logic operators are set so that it's actually possible to complete. This is the one that I actually just ran by accident. What I've added to the end of this is to check the previous statuses. Before, if something failed, it just went directly to the failed step. But when you're building workflows, you want to handle error cases. And trust me, from experience, it takes, you know, of the time it takes to build a workflow, 10% of it is building a workflow that works, and 90% of it is building a workflow that handles all of your error cases and edge cases. In this case, when this fails, it's not a total workflow failure. I want this to continue to another step to actually check the results. And based on the value of the results, I want to set the labels on the workflow so that it makes the user interface much more human readable. But when I look at these workflows, it's just demo. I have to drill down into it to see what it actually did. This latest version, when it was run, if it's just in the process of finding the file, the first JSON file, this is what it looks like, because I haven't changed the name of the work order, or I haven't changed the label for the work order. When it actually completes, it tells me that this one, it matched the provided checksum. So this found everything that it was looking for. The MD5 matched what it calculated. This one here, the MD5 didn't match. This one here, it timed out because I never received my media file. So this step here is what allows you to update your workflow or your work orders. Yeah, this step here allows you to update your work orders. And what I'm doing here is some custom scripting to do the inspection to determine what I want to do, and introduction of this work order metadata step, which let me show you that. So if my custom code here, which I'll get to, evaluates to true, I'm going to set the title status on success. So this step allows me to take a string, and I'm creating a work order label from the previous step, and I'm going to apply it if it's successful. And if it fails, I have another step here that I'm going to, you know, apply a work order label that I generate in the previous step. But for troubleshooting, I want to also, you know, it might be useful to have the work order ID attached to it. So I check this box, and it'll put a little a parentheses at the end of the work order label to show what the work order ID was for that failure. And we can see those here. If I move this over a little bit, my failures have the work order ID attached to the end of them. The success doesn't. And here's my my custom code. Orchestrator is natively written in Ruby. So if you're familiar with the Ruby programming language, you can jump right in and write custom code. This particular step is called a filter. If the very last statement in this evaluates to true, the step succeeds. If it evaluates to false, the step fails. I can specify the required inputs and optional fields. So here's a case where I'm actually going to take that step information from the previous steps and read it into these inputs. So I can look at the step information, step status, and if it's complete, then the result is true, and the output is, I set the output to the what did I set the output to? Work order label. Oh, I set it to the value the string that comes in directly from that step. So, the step provides me with a clear description of what happened. So rather than sticking my own description in there, I'm just taking the variable from that step output and filling it in and building a work order label that's appropriate for that case and whether or not it should follow the true or false path. With the new version of Orchestrator, there's also a Python plugin. So you can do essentially the same operation using Python code here in this interior block for your logic. So now you've got flexibility of 2 different programming languages for building any custom type of work. And then, the values that I'm bringing in, and it did it again. The values that I bring in for the label were generated by that step. So I get to the very end. All right, so let me go back to this. Just the failure isn't the end of the workflow. It can be a decision branch. The filter action allows for custom code, and it allows you to easily branch with a true or false evaluation as the very last command within the custom code. There's also a custom Ruby, which is essentially the same as the filter action, except it's got a different icon, and it doesn't do the true false evaluation at the end. So there's different use cases for each one. And the work order metadata, which allows you to not only set the titles, but you can also run these at the beginning of a workflow to extract information specific about the workflow, such as the work order ID, the workflow ID, the tags that are associated with it. You can add tags. One common use case for this is in an ingest workflow, you may parse an ADI file and get the ID out of the file for that particular asset and add that as a tag to the workflow. So now, if there's ever a problem, you can go in and search Orchestrator and punch in that ID from your ADI file, and it'll instantly show you all the workflows that took action on that particular asset based on the tags that your workflows inserted into the metadata of the workflows. So all of this, it gets us to the very end where we have a success or failure. And the whole point of this was I wanted to interrogate my media file and get some statistics from it only if it was valid, or I want to transcode the file only if it's valid. I don't want to waste time on things that that have the wrong MP5 or MD5 or the wrong file name that they obviously have to get delivered. I don't want to also take action on anything that is delivered without a media file because it's probably wasting my CPU. So I'll use the media info action, which I'm simply I'm telling it to use detailed mode because I want to, get as much information as I can out of it. And the value that I'm passing into it is the file name, which is coming from the watch for file, which means I had to carry that value through as an output from this step to this step to this step for the visible here on this last step. This particular plugin allows me to execute the application locally on my Orchestrator server. But in the case of Aspera transfers, you don't have to have your file system mounted on the Orchestrator server. It can use the Node API and see when files come in and move files around on the transfer server. So you may want to run this operation on a remote node that does have that file system mounted. So if you uncheck this, you could select a remote node, which are defined. They're defined here, and I can specify, the name of the node, my node, give it, the address of, where that machine happens to be. If it's a cluster, I can give it, an alternate address, and I tell it that it's, SSH, it's Linux, the port SSH ports on 22, and then once I set up my I also have to supply the username and password, obviously. Once that's defined, I can tell this media info application or this media info step to run it on a remote box and get the results back from that remote box. So Orchestrator is not actually doing the heavy lifting of a transcode or media info or a copy. It's reaching out and running that application on another box. This is just simply a specific version of a remote execution plugin, which allows you to essentially run any command line utility from a remote Linux box and have the output of standard output fed back into Orchestrator so that you can parse it and do whatever it is you want to do. You could even use this to run your existing Perl script or Bash script that does something in your current workflows that you don't want to have to port over into Orchestrator immediately. So you can link Orchestrator to portions of your existing workflow. So jump back over to here. And it's, still have it set for execute locally. So when I run this, I apologize for the long guy outside. You can probably hear it. So one fails because the MD5 doesn't match. One will fail after a minute because the media file won't be found. This is our one that it matched, and then it completes. I go down to the end and check on no, I think I ran the wrong one still. Well, I might have messed this example up because I was going to add one more example here, and that's now that we have our workflow that does something, let's make it modular, reusable. Make this whole validation process something that you can use in multiple places. So what I did is I took the workflow and then I stripped out some things from it. I stripped out the media info at the end because I don't know what I want to do after I verify it. I also stripped out the very beginning of it where I specify the location, and the file watcher for the JSON file at the beginning. So now this workflow expects a specific file name and a specific JSON file, value, the contents of the JSON to be passed into it, which you think, well, this is a step backwards. It's a manual process. I have to, when I run this, it's going to prompt me for these things. But a very powerful step in Orchestrator is a sub workflow. So now this becomes functionally the same as the last one we had, where I watch for a JSON file, I verify, and then if it was successful, then I run my operation afterwards. And the sub workflow specifies, you specify what workflow you want to run. You fill in the values that, it automatically pulls in the values that are required for that sub workflow. And then you specify out of all the steps in that sub workflow, what specific values you want to pull out of it. And I wanted to pull out file path. So when this works, well, when this runs, it's going to run this sub workflow and it's going to return a true false. And it's going to return the location of the media file, in which I can then run my my operation. I really should have given it a little bit more RAM to this virtual machine. So now the path for this step is coming from the verify sub workflow. And this workflow is much easier to understand. It doesn't have a whole bunch of steps. This step is clearly verify. I can even drag a post-it note over here and put my explanation of what I'm doing here. By the way, when I first saw this little post-it note plugin when I was at NAB a few years back, I thought that was just the coolest thing. I've been, anything to make documentation better. But anyway, getting back to just a straight linear workflow with just a few items, it's a whole lot easier to understand. And I really recommend taking advantage of sub workflows to break your code up into small, meaningful, easy to understand operations, linking them together in a top level workflow like this. And hopefully me going through the step of adding just a little bit at a time onto this workflow gives you a good idea of how the user interface works and some of the nuances of building workflows. Workflows are all about getting something done in the in your environment, but for the user to see what has been done, there's a thing called dashboards. And dashboards allow you to essentially visualize anything that you can think of through the programming language to display on the screen. We've got several things that are available as dashboards. They're called portlets here, and that's because a dashboard is a frame that can contain one or more portlets. So here's an example dashboard that's showing the the hourly workflow statistics for the workflow called VOD Manager, Incoming Asset Processing. Apparently that was a really important workflow that they wanted to have a single pane of glass to look at to see what was going on. When you're setting up a dashboard, you can split it horizontally or split it vertically when you're setting it up. And then each one of these sides, you can also split horizontally or vertically. So, given the constraints of your screen size, you can build, a workflow that has, very different pieces and different quarters or halves of your screen. So this is what it would look like, with something that was split side to side. Here's the contents of a transcoding queue, and here's the status of a resource management. This comes in, you would use this so that you don't, completely crush your transcoders. If they're optimized to handle 4 concurrent transcodes at one time, then don't have Orchestrator send more than 4. Orchestrator can keep track of those resources, and as soon as the count on the box goes down to 3, then it dispatches and sends another one to the transcoder. And some more example dashboards that other people have built. And this one I built for a customer. Some of these things don't have anything to do with Orchestrator at all. Like I have, I have some custom code that pings their external network connectivity to see whether it's up or down and shows the status. Keeps track of some critical some critical statistics that their ops center can have this up on a board, and as long as they don't see red, they're good. And the last thing that I wanted to cover was user inputs. You can, automation is great, but sometimes, you get to a point where an operator has to make a decision or do something to control the next step. And this is a cool user input. In this case, the workflow built a low resolution proof of the video file that could actually be previewed in the Orchestrator user interface, and the operator can then choose, where they're distributing it to. They can make changes to, the start time and stop time, and hit submit, and then the workflow picks up and runs from there to do whatever the operator did or wanted that particular asset to follow. So, it's all about automation, but it's also flexibility. When automation can't happen, you can assign these tasks to individual operators to, take the action that can't be done through scripting. So that's a very, very compressed example of what Orchestrator can do and how to make it do some useful things.
That's great, Randy. Thank you for going through all of that. I hope everybody can see how powerful Orchestrator is, and really we just sort of scratch the surface at for what some of those capabilities are.